Welcome back, everyone. Hey, this is Zach Edwards with another Adventure Box podcast episode given to you by Historical Conquest. And right now, it is a great time to buy Historical Conquest. It's Christmas, so we're always doing deals and discounts and other things to do with Historical Conquest. We also just ended the Create Your Own Card contest for a chance of $500. And in about a week, we're actually going to release them, the top 12, and you can judge on them. The person that gets the number one amount of votes gets $500. And if you're not part of it this year, join us next year on that. So stay tuned for all that. We're going to get more to it. But until then, as I teased you with last episode, I guess 2 episodes ago, on Monday, was today we're going to be talking about none other than George Washington. Now, why is George Washington so important with the French and Indian War? Because we're talking about the French and Indian War, right? Well, George Washington was actually part of the French and Indian War. That's right. He was a British officer, lower end officer, because he wasn't from Great Britain, but he was an officer. So George Washington, he had, I think he actually joined the service before he was 20 years old. But at age 21, 1753, he had an important task given to him by Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Yeah, Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie. Yes, okay. Governor Robert Dinwiddie to deliver a message for the French to withdraw from the Ohio Valley, to get out of there, get packing, because that's British land. Now, it took George Washington from October 31st till December in 1753 to actually arrive and deliver that message to the French at Fort Le Boeuf. Fort Le Boeuf. Yes, it is French, so I speak French, which I could not actually speak French because I am not that talented at the language of French. But I can speak in a great French accent. Okay, which is very poor, and I apologize to the French that might be listening to this. But the French decided, we are not leaving. You cannot force us out. This is our land. We have claim in this area. So, May 28th, 1754. This is 5 months later. Washington leads a surprise attack on a French, like I said last week, scouting party. Possible scouting party. Who knows what it actually was? But this scouting party was looking for possibly another fort, or, according to his brother, delivering a message. Well, the problem is there's no British out there because George Washington has not built Fort Necessity yet. So it makes me think, it's like, what are they talking about? So there's a skirmish that is known as the Jumonville Affair. And this results in the death of the French officer Joseph Colon de Jumonville. And it escalates tension. Now, what's important to understand here is after they'd taken the French troops captive, something happened. Most likely, they're saying, is that he was scalped. The French were scalped, at least Joseph was, by the Native American companions, allies with George Washington. And I think they were actually from the Iroquois Nation. But he was basically assassinated at that point. Again, his brother took deep insult to that. And so in July 3rd, 1754, so that same year, Washington and his troops surrender at the Battle of Fort Necessity. Now, this is where, again, George Washington had set up camp. Now, Washington signed the treaty to surrender. And according to the British, he knew what he was signing, but according to George Washington, he didn't know what he was signing. In that treaty, it was actually a letter implicating George Washington in the assassination of Joseph Jumonville. So, yeah, not the best time for George Washington. This was also when he was 22 years old, so still very young, leading this troop of British soldiers. Now, that was February. July 9th, 1755. This is like a year later. Actually, let's go a little bit back from there. So again, he surrendered Fort Necessity July 3rd. February 1755. Washington volunteers. Again, he's been insulted by this. He has been shown that ineffective at the time. And so he serves as the aide de camp to British General Edward Braddock, who sends an expedition up to try to take Fort Duquesne. Now, Fort Duquesne was a brand new fort. It was just being built by the French, and it was on the confluence, the coming together of two rivers to create the Ohio River. So, right in Pittsburgh, the tip of that island or that peninsula. Okay, so Washington joins on July 9th. Now it's what, 5 months later. There's a battle called the Battle of Monongahela. Now, Monongahela is actually the river that's right next to the fort. And they actually get attacked by the French and Native Americans during that time. They're ambushed by them as they're trying to come up and attack the fort. But they get an ambush on them before that point. So Washington basically distinguishes himself finally. He's given this chance. Again, now he is 23 to distinguish himself and rallying the retreating troops when Braddock is mortally wounded. But again, they retreat, they go away. Now, after this point, they don't really have that many successes for a while. 1756, Washington is promoted to colonel and made commander over the Virginia Regiment. So these are colonialists. No, regiment. I think this was actually British soldiers still. So he oversaw the defense of the western frontier against the raids by the French and their allies, the Native Americans, their allies. That was 1756. 1757, Washington struggles with supply chains and everything like that. He's not doing the very best. 1758. Now, this is, again, coming close to the Battle of Fort Duquesne. Washington participates. 1758. Again, what was it? It was Fort Duquesne. July 25th was when they, was when they actually captured the fort. So July 25th, 1758, Washington participates in the Forbes expedition and captures Fort Duquesne. And the British basically abandon it, destroy it. And at that point, it's very interesting because for some reason, Washington says, I'm done. And the British are probably like, what are you talking about? You're done. Well, George Washington has a very, very good reason for leaving. It's how the troops are being treated. Not the British troops, the colonial militia and such. All those that are from the colonies are not getting rank advancements. They're being demonized. Washington's probably being feeling the same thing. And he feels very frustrated with this. So basically he says, I'm done. He resigns his command. Now, what does he do afterwards? The British, they said, we'll get another one in there. Not a problem. But George Washington, he goes home and he gets married. 1759, he gets married to Martha Custis, something like that. She's a wealthy widow with substantial land. Now, how they met, I don't know any of that information, but this actually secured Washington financially for the rest of his life because she was actually a wealthy widow. And because her first husband passed away, she had the land of her own parents, so her own family land, and the land of the other gentleman. Now, this is also something very interesting to know because we're actually going to bring it up later on. But there is actually, I'm trying to remember where it is. Um, oh, yeah. Okay. So there was also a dowry for George Washington and Martha to marry. That dowry was the slaves that were actually part of the uh, deceased husband's estate. Now, this is interesting. These were technically George Washington's slaves, but they were not owned by George Washington. If he wanted to free them, he could not. He could not purchase them either. They were owned by the estate of Martha's dead husband, which could only be passed on to his heirs. So Martha and her ex-husband, or her former husband, their heirs could be the only ones that could take control over those slaves and over the estate that was his. Okay, so that's just some interesting information. We're going to get to that later on because we're going to talk about the controversy of George Washington owning slaves and being the beloved first president of the United States. There's so many things you don't know about, so keep listening. Okay, so he takes on the management of his own plantation at Mount Vernon. So everyone knows his estate being Mount Vernon. He actually owns a lot of other land because of the marriage beyond that. Now, what is he doing? So he is actually, before he becomes a civil servant, he's actually a land speculator, also known as a real estate buyer. So he's buying up real estate in all the different places. His actual profession is a surveyor. So he goes in, he surveys land, and he could take a portion of it as his payment. So this is a great lucrative business for him. And he takes other money that he makes on his plantation and such and puts it to buying additional land. So he's a large business owner. He's a large landowner at the time. He also has a lot of slaves at the time. But again, we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. 1758, so right after he leaves military service, he actually goes into civic leadership. And this is where he serves as the Fairfax County member of the House of Burgess. Now, in Virginia, their governing body was called the House of Burgesses. And in 1758, I think he actually, did he acquire it that year? Or was it that he campaigned for it that year? Either way, he became one of the Burgesses. And he held that position until 1775 when the American Revolution began. 1776. Yeah, so the year before it began. That's when he became into military service, where the House of Burgesses and the Continental Congress actually made him general over the whole army, the Continental Army. Anyways, that's later on in the story. So he becomes basically a leading speculator for the Western lands. So as they're moving more into the Ohio Valley, he is getting more land. And he's selling this land and such. He's actually one of the people in charge of surveying it and such. Okay, so all things are going great for him. And then what happens? Basically, the colonists at this point are saying, we are done with the British. We don't want them controlling us anymore. So, again, this is the 1750s. George Washington basically says the same thing. I'm done with the British. I don't want them governing us with us either, but we can't really do anything right now. So he's part of the Continental Congress when it begins. But before that time, there's no real body putting this together where all the colonies are together. All the colonies basically have their own governments. Well, this is also the time when the Stamp Act happens, 1765. Again, 7 years after George Washington leaves British service and joins the House of Burgesses. So he's a land speculator. He's part of the Virginia government. And all of a sudden he's hit with the Stamp Act. And remember, the Stamp Act was the British wanted a stamp on everything that was being sold inside the colonies. And if it didn't, it was smuggled in. And if it has a stamp, it's because you paid for that stamp as an additional tax. Well, that didn't last that long. But then came the Townshend Acts. And we're going to go over all these different acts later on. But George Washington is not happy with the British. He wasn't when he was in the military service because they treat him as subordinates, not just him, but all the colonial soldiers and militias. And then now he's overregulated by Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and all these other acts. And this just sends him into the American Revolution. But we're not going to go in there because we're still in the French and Indian War. Now, let me bring up the controversy of George Washington owning slaves. Okay, so as far as I know, and he probably did, but I don't know this, and it's not written down as far as I can find. George Washington, as far as we know, did not buy slaves. He inherited his slaves. Actually, he inherited his father's slaves at 11 years old, because I think Augustine, his father, Augustine Washington, died. So he had an amount of slaves. Actually, I think he had 10 enslaved people. And maybe it was just starting out that he had 10, but he also inherited his father's estate. And so, that being said, he had his family's slaves. Then he married Martha Washington before Martha Custis. Now, Martha, again, was a widow, and her husband had passed away. Now, she was in high society. She was very well connected. She was very well known by George Washington. And this was I won't say a match made in heaven, but this was a very good match because of everything they were already doing on individual parts, and coming together, they became like a power couple. So there was a lot of things that were happening. Now, Martha, not during the French and Indian War, but later on, you're going to learn about the American Revolution. She traveled with George Washington during the winters and took care of him and helped the camp followers and helped fund a lot of the soldiers to get clothing and such. Now, when Martha, when her husband died, her first husband died, she received what was called the dower slaves. Now, maybe this was actually the guy's name. I don't think it was. The dower slaves were individuals that were legally, again, part of their estate, but not legally their slaves. They were a part of the estate that was her ex-husband or her former husband's estate. So George Washington had, at this point, actually, I think by the time he was dead, he had 317 slaves, individual slaves. Now, let's break this up. George Washington died in 1799, basically 3 years after he retired from being the president. Poor guy. I don't know, actually, maybe 2 years after that. But this is a guy that has so busy, he doesn't have time to die. Then all of a sudden he retires, and 2 years later, he's gone, he's dead. Okay, so he has all of these slaves, enslaved people, manning his estates, multiple estates, whether it's Mount Vernon or his wife's former husband's estate. So there was a large change. They were not connected lands. They were different. So, and after Martha died, he actually lost all of those slaves. So all the slaves that were the dowry slaves went back to the heirs after Martha died. So he did not own or have any say over those people during that time. So let's go over his views of slavery. Now, he grew up a slave owner. His parents were slave owners. He was around wealthy people, slave owners. He was in the South. All these things basically said that he believed in slavery because that's how he grew up. But here's an interesting thing. When we get to the American Revolution, we're going to go over some of these stories. He spoke about in his journals, he spoke about his change of heart, his reverence and admiration for black soldiers, those that were fighting in there, even though they were slaves before, and even though some may even go back to slavery afterwards. And so he had a wide change in his belief on slavery. Now, again, this is American Revolution. A lot of things happened during that time. And he also faced, when he became president, he faced the fact that half of the colonies wanted to get rid of slavery, the other half wanted to keep them. How do you keep both of those happy? It's near impossible. They're never going to be happy. How do you keep them happy enough to keep united? Because he had to actually, remember, with the Constitution, they actually had to merge the states. They had to have at least 7 colonies in order to ratify the Constitution. You have 13 colonies, all different points of view when it came to slavery. Some that were adamantly against it, some that were adamantly for it, and a whole bunch that were like, we can go either way. So, I shouldn't say a whole bunch, and a few that were in the middle. They were just like, we can go either way. So, George Washington, he becomes president. Now, he did actually sign the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically made it so slaves had to go back to their original owners. But, which you might not, and you might have already heard that one before. But did you hear what he did with Pennsylvania? That's right. You probably haven't, because not many people talk about this. He actually helped strategically move enslaved individuals into Pennsylvania and hide them there as president. This is a personal actions while he's in office. This is not an official act, because he can't do that as president. But his personal actions were to strategically get them into Pennsylvania. Because if in Pennsylvania, if you're there for 6 months as a resident of Pennsylvania, you're granted your freedom. So all the people he helped bring into Pennsylvania were freed. You're like, but he's still a landowner. He should go to hell for that. And yes, sorry, I did actually say the word. It's a location. Okay. Now, you might say that, but here's an interesting part. Because of his change of heart, because of all the things that happened to him in his presidency, his will made a lot of the difference and helped people understand where his part was. Now, at the time of his death, he had 123 enslaved people under him. The ones that he, quote unquote, owned. I won't actually say that he owned them, but quote unquote, owned them. He had 123 enslaved people at that time. The others were actually part of Martha's former husband's estate. And so he was only able to write in his will that those 123 enslaved people, or anyone else that becomes enslaved under his estate, would be freed. All of them, 123 of them, you are now free in 1799. They died and were made free. Now, again, those that were part of Martha's dowry, a dower estate, so her dowry, that was not able to be touched, and those actually went back to the heirs after Martha's death. Now, Martha died after George Washington, so that's also a little bit to understand that it was Martha still had them, but in George Washington's will, 123 enslaved people were, upon the death of his wife, were released. So yeah, it was actually when his wife would die, that's when they'd be released. So 123 served Martha until she died, and then were let go. All the other ones, sad to say, they all went back to the father's estate. And there's nothing that George Washington or anyone could do, because that was actually part of the estate, and that went to Martha and her former husband's heirs. So all those that were born on her. So her children under the other husband had those slaves. And if they If they freed them, I don't know. Did Martha work with them to have them freed? I don't know. This is something for you to check out. Maybe there's documentation on it. I haven't looked, but that's got to be an interesting little tidbit. I wonder, Martha, if she had the same epiphany that George Washington had, and did she actually change her mind when it came to having slaves? And if she did she actually talk her children into releasing those slaves as well? And maybe they put it into their will as well. I don't know. Be interesting to find out. Yeah. So there you go. This is just a little bit more into the insight of slave ownership, because not all enslavers, not all people that owned slaves were evil, malicious individuals. Again, a lot of them grew up with slavery. They didn't know the difference when it came to anything different. Now, again, we might say that's baloney. Forget that. Everyone knew that was wrong. Actually, they didn't. Yes, some people thought those from Africa were actually inferior. I can't say anything about what they said beyond the fact of what we already say, that the institute of slavery is wrong. We now know that. But if I can't say that everyone knew that back then. We might know one thing and somebody think another thing. Again, I can't say that it is wrong for their civilization at their time. I can say, sorry, let me restate that. I can say that it's wrong. Slavery, no matter what, is wrong. But in their minds, I can't say that they saw it the same way as us. I can't say that they actually saw it as evil and malicious, which it is. But for all those people, George Washington is the only founding father that actually freed all his slaves that way. William Penn also owned slaves now, way before George Washington, and did the same thing. He released all of his slaves upon his death. So, and what happened to a lot of those slaves if they were released, again, in the South? They would have been picked up and made slaves again. Definitely during William Penn's time, William Penn had slaves, they would actually be made slaves again because they didn't have the laws that they do have now. So now, that being said, yeah, I can't justify what they did in my eyes. I can only justify what they did in their eyes. And to have empathy with them, we need to be able to understand where they're coming from when it came to that. They grew up, they knew in their heads that slavery was an okay institution. George Washington, as you know, as I just told you, learned it is not an okay institution. And after his death, after his wife's death, because he died first and then his wife, they were all to be freed. So that's an important thing to know. Again, seeing it from the mind of and the eyes of the people that you're learning about, but also substantiating that it is not right in your heart that this should ever happen again. We can't change the past. We can learn from it so that we don't make the same mistakes twice. And we love making the same mistakes that are in history, but it's because we don't learn it anymore. In schools, it's rarely ever taught. Okay, I'm going to stop doing this rant. I appreciate you spending the time with me as we go through Washington's change in career into becoming the president that we know. And as for the controversy behind the president, especially with slave ownership, there's a lot more to it than really meets the eye. It's not a normal slave owner like you see down south, that you saw down south in the Carolinas and the plantations and such. I'm not saying it's completely different, but there was a lot of difference. And that was because George Washington learned of it being wrong. And I appreciate that he freed him afterwards. I wish he freed him before, but there's probably reasons why he didn't. Could be that he quite enjoyed their company or the comforts. Could be that way. But at the same time, there are actual laws that say you cannot just free a slave in some states. But when you die, you can free the slaves through that way. So all things to know. Beyond that, look it up. Have fun looking it up. Learn as much as you can about history and the the very bad things that we do in history, that America did, that the world did. Again, slavery is a global institution. We are actually one of the lower perpetrators of it. Brazil had like 10 times as many slaves and were 10 times worse to those from the colonies. At the same time, that does not justify what we did at all. Just letting you know, slavery was a global thing. And I'm glad that it's not here anymore when it comes to African Americans, but also to know that there is still slavery going on. Slave trade, certain types of slavery that I won't even mention because it's not appropriate for this podcast. There's all these different types of slaves, and they should all be freed. And if there's a way to free them, and I could be part of that, I would be part of that because I've learned it from history. Because I've learned about these evil institutions that are slavery. Not looking at it from the person's point of view, but looking at it from my own point of view. Now, I can have empathy for those that actually had them and treated their people well. But again, that's enough to be said about that. Look it up, have your own opinions on it, and move forward. Don't move backwards, not go back in history. Move forward, learning from history. Thank you so much for joining me on this great Adventure Box podcast day, and we will talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.